Welcome. Thank you for attending today's webinar hosted by the Organization Development and Change and Workforce Education and Development program at Penn State. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming our presenter, Dr. Dena Lang and Dr. Patricia Macko. My name is Jenny Lee, and I'm a PhD candidate in Workforce Education and Development program. We also have Second Gary with us today, who will be managing chat feature and Q&A session. In terms of the interactive format for this webinar, please open the chat feature in the Zoom platform to interact. If you have any questions about the presentation, please use Q&A feature on Zoom. You can see the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Click the Q&A button and write your questions. The Q&A session will be at the end of the presentation. Our online Master of Professional Studies in Organization Development and Change can help you prepare to implement quality and continuous improvement initiatives in an organization. Furthermore, there is a PhD program in Workforce Education and Development with a concentration in Human Resource Development and Organization Development. Our program has created a continuous monthly webinar series with experts around the world. Today, we welcome Dr. Dena Lang and Dr. Patricia Macko. Dr. Lang is the Associate Director of the Engineering Leadership Development Graduate Programs at Penn State University. She holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from West Virginia University, an MBA from Johns Hopkins University, and a PhD in Kinesiology with a focus on Biomechanics from Penn State University. Dr. Dena Lang has taught project management for the last 6 years for workforce education and engineering. She also teaches engineering across cultures. These courses are part of the online engineering leadership and innovation management graduate certificate. Our co-presenter, Dr. Macko, is a full-time OD consultant with Geisinger Health System in Danville, Pennsylvania. She holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from Bloomsburg University, a master's from Bloomsburg University, and a PhD in workforce education and development from Penn State University. Patricia's previous professional experiences and research interests range from human resource management, talent development, organization development, project management, competency development and assessment, and senior leadership development. Here are Dr. Lang and Dr. Macko.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We've had a really fun time putting this presentation together, and I just wanted to set some understanding up front. The presentation itself goes more into the OD practitioner world than it does the theory world. We certainly will go through some models, but just to set the stage for you, this is coming from the OD practitioner world, or consulting world, I should say. So some of the objectives we wanted to go through today was to build an understanding of how OD professionals really link project management, organization development, and whole system change or whole system transformation. We want to build an understanding of whole system approach and what that really looks like and how that differs from maybe an OD intervention. We want to illustrate different models that we use in the OD practitioner world that really help us link to that project management side, such as RACI, Gantt charts, impact maps, and we'll go through a few more. We want to explain the different softwares or systems that can be used when you're really working in that whole system change or whole system transformation and project management world. And then last but not least, we want to build an understanding of how the OD professional roles really do change as you move towards that whole system transformation change. So whole system, a lot of times you'll hear people talk in two different terms there. They may say whole organization change. They may say whole system change. They may say whole system transformation change. So there are differences there, but for today's purposes, we want to talk about that whole system approach. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is and how that we really need to understand how project management really goes into the whole system change. So just to kind of start our conversation today, there are many changes that have happened because of our global environment that we work in on a day-to-day basis. And some of these particular changes you will hear come up very often. So things like regulatory compliance changes, certainly in the healthcare industry that I'm in, that has changed how we do business a lot and can impact the entire organization. Competition does not slow down nowadays. It is heavier and heavier, no matter which industry you're in. Employee attitude change. So that's one that's relatively new over the last like 5 years. And because of that, or what brings that about, is the fact that we have sometimes 4 or 5 actual generations in one workforce. So employee attitude has a lot to do with whole system change. Technology isn't slowing down, it's only speeding up. So be used to that. And then the aging workforces. So these are just some of the usual external environment pieces that can impact what we do on a day-to-day basis. The other pressures that are internal pressures to us that really lead to large-scale OD intervention and whole system transformation is the pressure to reduce costs. There's always, how can we still reduce the cost? How can we increase productivity? How can we speed up the cycle of a product development? And I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. How do we increase innovation, constant increase of innovation, increase technology use? Again, in the OD world, I'd have to rank that up there as number 1. Increase employee engagement and increase talent development needs. So those are some of the internal pressures that we get on a regular basis. But what I'd like to do now is to have just a little interaction through the chat, and our producer will, Sangun, will give me the answers here. But those were the anticipated types of pressures that we get on a day-to-day basis that can affect the whole system change. What have you seen in your organizations that may have been unanticipated change over the last year to 2 years? And if you'd go ahead and put your answers in the chat, and then we'll check in with Sagun in just a moment.
So we have a couple of responses coming in right now. So one of them is COVID, and that is another person, Melissa, also talks about transition to working fully remote and anticipating staying that way after COVID. So the theme right now is COVID. There's also another one, which is lack of readiness and extensive working remote.
Right. So thank you for those that participated in the chat, and I'll give you the answer now that I was hoping for. COVID. So yes, COVID was the right answer here. That certainly was a unanticipated change that really threw a lot of the organizations for a loop. We were not prepared at times in many different ways, but from an OD intervention side, the OD professionalists or practitioners within our organization had to rise to the top, and we had to do it very, very quickly. So I was very thankful that I had the project management side, because I was asked to lead many different initiatives going through COVID. So when you talk about the pressures of what COVID brought to us, certainly taking your workforce to remote work, that was up there at the top. for healthcare individuals, we had also challenges of enough doctors, enough nurses. How does our supply chain have to change? You know, how do we get enough ventilators coming in? How do we upskill perhaps RNs to do different types of work in different parts of the organization? So many changes came through very quickly, and we no longer had the luxury of having months to make change happen. We had to make it change within hours. So that was huge for our organization. But those are things that I think now we will totally be much more prepared for in the future because of what we went through with COVID. So what I started talking about whole system transformation and whole organization OD interventions. And some of the things that we go through with that as OD practitioners, you really have to have your understanding and education behind you on the frameworks and models that you can use that's really going to help you as a practitioner. So I wanted to share with you just a couple that I know I personally have used over and over again for the initiatives here at Geisinger. So one of the frameworks that I use a lot, and of course this is the 8S framework now, but it was the 7S when I pulled it up on the screen. But the McKinsey 7S framework is a great framework to use when you're talking about whole organization. Where it changed over the years to become the 8S is they took staff and made it resource, and then they also actually put the 8th S, which was organization performance. So that's really important when you're working on whole system change, to think about how this change will impact the performance of your organization. So that's one of my favorite frameworks to use when I'm looking at whole system or whole organization change. The next one is more of a whole system transformation model, and where that kind of differs from the McKinsey model is this particular model really looks at 3 different parts. It looks at assessing where you are right now, where's your current state, understanding what the need is in your current state, and then the plan for transformation and making it a strategic effort. And then aligning it to your true North goals or your true strategic priorities and goals of the organization, and then moving to an execution phase. And you will see that you go through those different elements within that particular circle, like build, redesign, and solving the actual problem. So that's one model that I really like to use. The other models that I use are more change management models. The different models I really like to use are the Kotter's 8-step change model. If you don't know that one yet or don't have it done, I suggest that as an OD practitioner, that's one of the better ones to truly understand, because I think it is all inclusive of what is needed to understand in a change model. The other model that I use a lot here with senior leaders that is easily understood is the ADKAR model. So the ADKAR model is definitely one that I think is very easy to train out, very understandable, but also is easy for us to really take a more holistic view. One of the most important things when you're working with change is to always understand the holistic or humanistic side of change, because sometimes when we're using some other models, those particular models don't really get involved in, the holistic or the humanistic side. How do people resist change? Why do people resist change? So the ADKAR model is one that really gets into that humanistic side that I like. So when you're talking about the whole system change models or transformation, I think it's important to understand, well, why do we need to understand why we're calling this a large scale OD intervention or a whole system transformation. And the difference is that some of the differences is that the key stakeholders that are involved are at all different levels throughout the organization. So when you say whole system, you have key stakeholders from all over the organization that are involved in these types of changes. The other thing is that you want to understand that whole system and large scale interventions, OD interventions, the time frame of how this work is done is really expansive. So sometimes some of the OD interventions or the large scale change that we're trying to make, it could take you a year to a year and a half to complete that work. So it's not something that is easily changed or easily completed. You really need to understand the actual whole system approach. And then the practitioner's role. So the OD practitioner role, I cannot really highlight this enough, but what I've seen over the last 3.5 years after getting my PhD in workforce education and development is the OD practitioner role really changes. And we'll get into that a little bit more at the end of the presentation, but that practitioner role has many different flavors or hats that I change on a day-to-day basis. So we really want to talk, what we really wanted to talk about today was, well, what is the need to keep this project management, change management, transformation, and everything moving in tandem? So what we wanted to share was a live example, but I'm going to turn it over to Dena for just a couple seconds, and then she'll turn it back to me.
Thank you, Pat. Throughout the rest of the presentation, we want to walk you through a case study example that illustrates both the change management process and the project management process. And this will be for a real project that Pat has worked on in the past. So as we discuss the project, we'll walk through the project life cycle, and this includes project initiation, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and project closure. And then at the end, we'll end with some lessons learned from the example. Next slide, please. So the first phase in the project life cycle is project initiation, and this starts with the identification of a need, problem, or an opportunity, and this forms the basis of the project. During project initiation, you might conduct a needs assessment or a feasibility study, and you'll also develop the project objectives. You'll identify the project scope, deliverables, stakeholders, and develop a statement of work. You also typically develop a business case for the project. You want to be able to justify the expenditures for the project relative to the benefits that the business is going to receive. So the project initiation phase typically produces the project scope statement and the project charter. And the charter is a document that includes all of the information I just mentioned, but it's usually signed off by the customer or the sponsor. And this officially authorizes the launch of the project. The elements in the charter are usually at a high level, and the details of the project are worked out in project planning. So next slide, and I will turn it back over to Pat to discuss how her project was initiated.
Thanks, Dena. So I wanted to put real life to this particular example, and I will share an example from an initiative we did in 2019 that is still progressing. So in 2019, we did a whole system learning and development needs assessment. So it was just like it stated here, that it went throughout the whole system. So we had to have the sponsors were the executive leadership of our organization. And we went throughout the organization with surveys, questionnaires, focus groups, one-on-one interviews. And again, the stakeholders came from all over the organization. The people that we interviewed were at all different levels, so that we really could get a clear understanding of what our needs are in learning and development here at Geisinger. So the findings that we actually gathered at the end of the needs assessment were we needed a comprehensive talent development strategy. And we'll go through each one of these in just a second. We needed a new competency model for the organization. We needed a new human capital management system, and we went with Workday. We needed to develop more robust leadership development programs. So these were some of the really big pieces we identified through the needs assessment. This is not our talent management strategy. This is just a general graphic of a talent management strategy. Some of our information is proprietary information, so we don't share that outside of Geisinger, but it gives you an example of when you're talking about this particular piece, this initiative that we undertook, the talent management strategy. There were individuals throughout the whole, what we call 1HR, involved within developing this particular talent management strategy. I was asked to lead the project from the talent management side. So again, that's one of the hats that I wear, is to be that subject matter expert for talent management here at Geisinger. We needed a human capital management system. Ours was very antiquated, and we needed a system that could really work with understanding how can we develop people internally. So can it house an individual development plan? Can it meet our needs as far as talent, building talent pools within the organization? So there's many things that happen in Workday, and I know Penn State actually took on Workday a couple years back, so I won't spend too much time on that. A competency model. This was probably the biggest initiative in my mind, because competencies are needed to be interjected into each piece of the talent management strategy. And our talent management strategy actually has 12 pieces that go throughout the whole life cycle of the employee. So within this particular initiative, we had to select the core competencies, select the leadership competencies, actually work on individual levels of contribution, and then identify the behaviors surrounding these competencies. And last but not least, one of my true focuses here at Geisinger now is the senior leadership development programs. So we had to make sure that once we had things like the competency model developed, we were building out plans at the same time for how do you include this into the different levels of leadership programs here at Geisinger. I'll turn it back over to Dena. Thanks.
The next phase in the project life cycle is project planning, and it really is the most important phase in project management. So during the planning phase, various project plans are created, and I'll show a few of those to you in a few minutes. You also create a work breakdown structure that shows all the work that needs to be done. And you use diagrams to help visually represent the work and the relationships among all the activities. You also estimate schedules and budgets during planning. You identify the resources you need. And another critical part of planning is identifying, anticipating risks and planning for them. So project planning really helps to drive communication. It provides better efficiency and fewer mistakes. They help to unite and focus the project team, and it also helps to create accountability on the team. The plans also help to keep on schedule, and they can prevent team overload by managing the entire workload of all the team members, particularly when the resources are assigned to multiple projects. And while it might be counterintuitive, plans can also help to be more flexible to adapt to change. It more easily allows you to anticipate the impact of the change and adjust the plan. Next slide, please. Once we've identified the project deliverables, the requirements, scope of work, then we can start to identify all the work activities that need to be done to produce those deliverables. We do that through a work breakdown structure, or WBS, and we have one shown here. This is really at a high level for our case study example. Obviously, there's a lot more tasks required for this project, but we're just trying to illustrate the concepts here. So typically the work breakdown structure is developed around the project deliverables, and it's structured in work packages. So in this example, as Pat had mentioned, we have 3 primary deliverables or work packages, and they included the competency model, the human capital management system, and the leadership development program. So technically the higher level part of the WBS is considered the WBS, and under them are the activities or tasks that you use. So traditionally you see the WBS part of it written with nouns. They're representing the things you're producing, and then the activities obviously are written with verbs. It's showing the work that needs to be done. So in this example, the model is represented visually like a org chart, but it can also be presented as a long list of summary tasks and activities with the hierarchy, and the tasks are all numbered. And this allows you to keep track of each of the tasks. So in this example, the competency model work package includes activities for building the list of core competencies, building the list of leadership competencies, identifying levels of contribution, and identifying the behaviors surrounding those competencies. So on some projects, probably large projects, you track the work packages by assigning a control account number to them, so that then all activities under the work package are tracked for spending. Next slide, please. All right, network diagrams can help you visualize the relationships and the timing among all your activities. And this slide shows, again, a high level network diagram for the relationships that we, for the tasks that we just went over on the previous slide. Again, there's a lot more tasks in the project, but this is just illustrating the concept. So in a network diagram, when one task has to be complete before another one starts, the first one is a predecessor to the second one. You can't start the second task until the first task is complete. So if we look at, I know this is hard to read, it's so small, but if you look at the human capital management plan work package in the middle, we first have to identify all the areas of the system to develop, and then we build out the tasks. So identifying the areas is the predecessor to building out the tasks and so on. So within PM software, you can assign predecessors to your tasks, and you really need to critically think through all tasks and relationships so that you've captured everything. It's once you've done this and you've accounted for all the tasks and relationships, the network diagram helps you to identify the critical path. And this is the longest path in your project. It dictates the total duration of the project. And knowing this helps you to determine if there's any potential project delays and where to focus your resources. Next slide, and I'll turn it back to Pat for a minute.
So another one of the tools that I like to use when I'm working in the project mode or with the OD interventions is something called a RACI chart. And why I like this is it keeps us focused as a team, as a project team. So the RACI chart is very easy to understand, but it's one that all team members can reflect back to, especially when a project team may get off track, which can happen at times. We really want to make sure of, so the R stands for responsible. That is really who is responsible at the end of the day for making sure that that project is on track, that will be completed, that stays within budget. The A stands for accountable. So the accountable people are the ones really doing that hard work and completing the task on a day-to-day basis. The C is for consult. So who truly just needs to be consulted and maybe sometimes give an approval if something changes. And then who is just informed. So informed might be a higher level person that just needs an update every once in a while on how the project's going. So this is a chart that I use at all times when I'm working with my projects. The impact map is another tool. Sometimes when you're working with the senior leadership folks, they really like a quick snapshot of what is it that the participants are going to be learning? How are we going to do? What are we going to do to help them learn? And then what is truly that business result? What's the value of undertaking this initiative? So I started this type of impact map, and it seems to work with the higher levels because they really want true quick snapshots. So an impact map can really do that, explain that to all levels of the organization. I'll turn it back over to Dena.
As I mentioned before, risk management starts in the planning phase, and this is where the risks are identified and planned for. Risk management's about understanding the potential future unknowns and planning for them to both mitigate the chance of them occurring, as well as to plan for how best to respond if they do occur. So some of the tools that we use for risk management include a risk assessment matrix. It's shown here on this slide, as well as a risk register, which is very similar to the matrix, and then a risk management plan. The risk matrix provides a visual depiction of the risks, and it helps to develop a mitigation plan. And in this matrix, we've illustrated 3 risks from the example project, and Pat will take over and discuss the risks.
Yeah, so there are a lot more risks, of course, but I just threw 3 of them in here to talk about. One of the biggest risks is understanding that what could happen if there is a lack of senior leadership support. The senior leadership support is critical throughout the whole transformation or the whole intervention. So you may even have to revisit that, because the impact is if you don't have that support throughout the whole type of change, then other employees will not follow your lead either. The actual outcomes you wanted to get, you will be able to see very quickly on who adapts to the change, who doesn't adapt to the change. And what you really have to do to overcome that is to have a response plan that says, how are we going to revisit with senior leaders so that we can encourage them to communicate over and over in different settings about what we are trying to do with this particular intervention or change. What's the value to the organization? So that communication and putting the sponsorship on senior leaders always helps. The other thing was Workday incompatibility with existing systems. So we didn't know until way into the weeds, I would say, what was going to be mostly compatible with Workday and what wasn't. So we had to go back and really think about what happens if. So for instance, we had an old antiquated system that housed a lot of things like our performance evaluations and so on and so forth. That couldn't actually be integrated right into Workday. We can certainly house them as a file, but it couldn't be brought over and really integrated into the system. So we really had to move back, take a step back and be prepared. How are we going to communicate with leaders what is going to be able to be brought into Workday, what wasn't able to be brought in, and how do we really move forward from there? And then, whoops, sorry. What about when employees don't support the new change? And that does happen, where you need to really make that change stick and operationalize and institutionalize the change. And all of a sudden you have a group or a percentage of employees that aren't following along. Perhaps even with the system, let's take Workday. Workday was not cheap. It was a couple $1 million, right? If you have employees that just do not take to Workday or refuse to take to Workday, you could end up having a huge system that is a very good system, but maybe only use 10% of that system because you have employees that are not supporting that change. So the response plan for that one is really more about going back to those senior leaders at sponsors and really having them communicate out the need for the change again, and the impact that this will have on the organization once we have all employees actually using the new system. And we do have to do that.
Thanks, Pat.
Yep.
On this slide, we're providing a link to a website that provides a whole lot of free templates for various project management plans. So I mentioned before that there's a lot, and technically the project management plan includes a whole lot of sub plans, and they're listed here. And these are plans for managing risk, scope, schedules, requirements, relationships, quality, procurement, process improvement, cost, configuration. You can see this is long, change, communications, and human resources. So for large projects, they really do have a plan for each of these, but even on smaller projects, you need to be thinking about them. So the website also includes templates for some other project documents, such as the risk register. So if you want to take a screenshot of that web link, you might find it helpful. And I just highlighted here the change management plan, since that's another main theme of our presentation today. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the next phase of the project life cycle, which is project execution, and that's followed by monitoring and controlling. And these two phases are often listed separately, but they're both occurring simultaneously once the project work begins. So during project execution, the work starts to complete all the activities that we have in our work packages. And during this time, communication really is critical with all the stakeholders throughout project execution. And then as the work begins, the schedule, budget, scope, and quality are continuously monitored and compared back to the project baseline plans to ensure that the project work's staying on track. And during this time, monitoring and controlling are critical. And these activities help to ensure that the quality requirements are being met, but that scope creep isn't occurring. So during project execution, the project team and the project manager need to make certain that all the requirements are being met, but not allow additional work to be added to the project that was not originally in the scope. It's often tempting to add additional bells and whistles without accounting for the impact to the schedule and the budget. So anytime additional work or even reductions in scope happen, they require official change requests, and these are agreed upon by the project manager and the customer. And you then need to make modifications to the schedule and the budget in response to those changes. So next slide, and Pat will take over for a minute.
So we talked at the beginning of the presentation. I think one of the important things to understand too as a practitioner, OD practitioner, is that when you're working in tandem with project management and whole system change, you can be asked to play different roles within that particular initiative. And one of them is certainly an HR business partner. So for instance, with Workday, there was a lot of the different areas of HR, benefits, payroll, recruitment, talent development. So being an HR business partner at times, a transformation expert, I don't know if I'd say expert, but you do need to understand that when you're working with the transformation change and whole system change, that you're really getting into even the culture of the organization and how do we change this culture. So that's different. And strategic business partner, so you want to be viewed, and that's what's critical for understanding project management, is you want to be viewed as a strategic business partner so that you can work hand in hand with the senior levels within the organization. A change agent, you need to really support that change and be able to communicate that change out in a very positive manner. That's difficult some days, but we are looked at as change agents also. And the visionary part is not only seeing what we have today, what we know we had in the past, but truly being able to look out into the future to say, here's what this could be. So the transformation, really getting people to open up their minds to see what's possible. And then last but not least, I cannot stress this enough, is as an OD practitioner or consultant, you really need to have a good base of project manager. being a project manager and project management understanding. That will really set you apart from other OD consultants if you have that background.
Thanks, Pat. Part of the monitoring and controlling phase also includes regular project status reporting to your stakeholders. And this slide provides an overview of a typical rating system that's used to track project status. The red can indicate significant issues that could include missed deadlines or running over budget, quality issues or testing errors, etc. And then yellow shows concern in these aspects, but the project's trending in the wrong direction. It's not as bad as red. And then green indicates all well. So we wanted to mention that there's a number of ethical issues in project management, and that one of the most prevalent, it revolves around this. It's false reporting on project status or moving a project forward when the status isn't green, or there's issues that have been reporting. And there really is a lot of pressure on a project manager to present a positive light. And some organizational cultures often promote overly optimistic reporting, and they discourage any negative reporting. So it's imperative that the organization promotes a culture that's accurate and timely, and that the project manager not give in to higher administration if they're encouraging them to move forward, even though there have been concerns noted. So now Pat will take over again and provide some examples of where she's faced these types of pressures.
Yeah, so this is really important to understand that there are times where sponsors may be some of the concern, where they want a project done faster than was anticipated, and actually we have it on track, but they may decide that, no, we want it done a little bit sooner. So you cannot, as Dena talked about predecessors and successors, you cannot at times change some of that project out because certain things have to be done before other things, right? So you have to have a strong backbone as an OD professional or consultant to really push back to say this was anticipated, we are on track, but we are not ready to sign off yet. There are other steps that still must be completed before we can move forward. The other thing that I've had happen several times is working with external consultants on a project. Sometimes an external consultant will want the work to be done so that it can be signed off so that they can get paid. Makes sense. I know that they have to get paid also, but you really have to make sure that you are responsible as a project manager or as a project lead to make sure that you do understand the ethical issues that can happen if people are pressuring you to move from red to yellow or yellow to green. So have a backbone, be able to explain to people, go to the right sponsors, but do not move forward just because someone is pressuring you on that.
Thanks, Pat. As Pat mentioned early on, there's many different software packages or tools that can be used in project management. And this graphic includes a lot of them. And most of these packages provide agile methodologies, budget management, collaboration tools, Gantt charts, milestone tracking, and portfolio management. And in our project management courses, we primarily use Microsoft Project or Project Libre. And Pat personally uses Jira, which is specifically designed for software and support teams with best-in-class agile tooling. They also have deep developer tool integrations and a focused project experience for the entire software team. And the agile tool allows departments such as operations, marketing, testing, and sales to all work together and plan, track, and manage in collaboration with the software teams. Next slide, please. That brings us to the last phase of the project life cycle, and it is project closing. And the closing phase starts when all the deliverables have been handed over to the customer and all the project work is complete. But there's still activities that need to be done. And those activities are typically include collecting and making final payments, recognizing and evaluating your staff, conducting a post-project evaluation, and this might include surveys or interviews with your customers or stakeholders. And another important part of project closing is to document lessons learned. And these really do become a valuable part of your organization's repository, and it provides important insights for future related projects. And then along the same lines, the phase includes organizing and archiving your project documents. And these documents also become part of your historical data for future projects. And it's particularly helpful when you're estimating budgets or schedules. And it helps to streamline that process when you're working on similar projects that are related. So now Pat will share some of the lessons learned from her project example on the next slide. Thanks.
Thanks, Dena. So last but not least, the lessons learned is a part of project management that really needs to be done. Sometimes project teams want to just close and leave, scatter, and not look back. But what you really need to do is really sit down and take a look at what went well and what could be enhanced in the future so you don't repeat those moving forward. When you're dealing with whole system transformation or whole system changes, sometimes one of the biggest problems that I see out there is inadequate resources. So do we have the right expertise inside for all the different components that we're going to be looking at? You really have to understand the resources needed, and do we have it? And if we don't, how are we going to get it? Do we outsource that piece? You know, so you have to take a look at all that. The competing priorities. So when you're working with the highest levels of the organization, getting them to really take a look at all the different initiatives that are happening at one time, not just the new initiative that they want to work on at this particular timing, because when you have competing priorities, usually you're going to end up with a workload to resource disaster at some point if you're not looking at a high enough level to have it all sketched out somehow to say, here's all the initiatives we're working on, here's the resources we need, and what is the timing for this particular initiative to start and end. More time needed to educate staff on working on projects, really educating how to work in a team, how to work as a project team. I see that that's a problem at times. Educating on why the initiative's being done. What's the value to the organization so that the team members can really understand why they're part of this team. And I was surprised that at times we put these project teams together and even the project team doesn't seem to understand what the true value or why is the organization needing, wanting, and going to complete this initiative. And then just lack of ability to think of innovation. This is one of, I think, the top concerns that I have going into project teams is being able to have different levels of individuals on the team from different areas of the organization. And it sometimes the longer tenured employees are the ones with the least amount of opening in their brains to new innovation. So we get stuck sometimes or paralyzed on what we've had in the past, what we've tried in the past, and not let's open our brains up totally to say, what could we have in the future? So these are some of the lessons learned in the particular examples that I was sharing with you today. These are just some recommended resources as we completed this particular presentation for today. And I'm going to turn it over to Sangun just to see, I see there are some questions in the Q&A. So if you want to let us know what those questions are, we can give answers to those.
Thank you, Dr. Macko. We have a couple of questions here. The first one is from Mark. He asks, what are the top line learnings from our COVID experience to date and the implications for how practitioners embracing both an OD and PM perspective themselves need to change?
Wow, that is a great question. We could have a whole presentation, I think, just on the answer to that question. I think preparing employees moving forward how to be nimble, how agility comes into play, how to quickly but yet thoroughly think about innovative ways. So innovation and training on innovation, training employees on transformation, because transformation really, in transformation, it talks about building a sense of urgency. So urgency was definitely one of the big factors. There are many things. I'm not sure of what all, but when you take a look at what we went through, we had to quickly turn a lot of our different service lines forward. For instance, telemedicine. We were doing a very, very small percentage of service with telemedicine. Telemedicine has moved to the top of the service line now, that will not go away, that will continue to be a service line of ours. So that was the service line. Supply chain. So if you could imagine doing vaccines for hundreds of thousands of individuals, we had to have the right people internally that just could take a look at just that factor and turn it around very quickly. We had to find housing for doctors and nurses because if they were exposed to the virus, we had to then quarantine them and quarantine them outside their houses. So we had to find literally housing that we could quarantine people for. So as far as the learning and development, I would say really the innovation, the being able to think innovatively very quickly, being agile, or the agility of turning things around, strategic mindset, so that you are still being able to think strategically long term as you're trying to solve for short term, if that makes sense. Knowing that as an OD practitioner, those many different roles that you could play on any different day or initiative, I think that's very important.
Thank you. Dr. Lane, do you want to add to that?
I really didn't experience a whole lot of issues personally. I work at Penn State and I actually teach online mostly. So my transition was pretty smooth. But I will add that I think COVID probably highlighted the need and how critical risk management is. So I'm certain moving forward, as people are planning projects, they'll have a lot of a new perspective on thinking about the risks and planning for them. And like Pat said, supply chain was really disrupted. So really figuring out what your alternatives are and planning for them. So I think COVID has just highlighted the importance of risk management and planning.
I forgot two very important things that I'd like to add to that. And one is there was a mention of work from home. So I think we're still experiencing the change in that and still setting expectations for how that looks and feels for an organization. I think there still needs to be work done on expectations of working from home. I know as a learning and development professional, there's a lack sometimes of understanding that just because we're in home environments, there aren't certain expectations that are still there. So I think we need to do that. The other thing is from the learning and development side, we had to very quickly, we did a lot of our senior leadership programs face-to-face, and within a month, we had to have them turn around to virtual. And of anybody that facilitates online knows that it's sometimes very difficult to do that quickly. So I think those are two other places that we need to prepare and upskill individuals for that type of change.
Thank you. So we have another question from Nagar. She asks about transformational model. Would you consider including foresight and readiness in this model, as this model may hinder organizational ability to be more proactive and less reactive?
Yes, I would definitely change. And again, we used models here today that I said that I use, but there are so many. And really, sometimes you have to look at the structure of your organization to be able to decide what types of models. But particularly having a transformation model that will allow you to be proactive and not reactive, because that's what you're trying to get away from, is not being reactive to something that's happening in the environment, but being very proactive. So she is absolutely correct that you should have that model that's going to push that proactive side.
We have another question from Marcin Sikora. So this is to Dr. Lang. According to my knowledge of process groups, process groups are running in the project more or less in parallel with various intensity over time. Among many other reasons, this is assuring continuous improvement, updating various documents, etc. In the presentation, they are visualized as phases, like they are in a series. Is my understanding wrong, or is there any specific purpose in presenting process groups in phases? Thanks in advance for advising.
You are actually correct. They are occurring at the same time. The project life cycle it's historically presented that way. Now, for example, initiation has to occur. It is its own phase, and project closing is its own phase. But project planning is the first phase to start, but it's planning it's an iterative process. So, as things happen during execution, there can be modifications to all of the planning documents. So that is iterative. And as I said before, execution and monitoring and controlling, they're typically shown as separate, but they're happening at the same time. So as the work after planning, as the work's being done, it's being continuously monitored, and then that monitoring and the outcomes of completing work lead to modifications in the planning. So those three middle stages are iterative. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. We have another question from Steph Corby. So he asks, is a project manager with 15 years of project management experience obtaining a master's in OD? What is your advice in taking steps from the PM path towards the OD path? Thank you.
So he's already a project manager, has that experience behind him for 15 years, and he's coming over to the OD side, correct?
Yes.
The steps. So is he thinking about going into the OD courses, or is he already there?
That was not elaborated. Sorry.
So I think that moving from OD or moving from project management to OD, there are some things in OD that can really help you understand better how to link those two together. One of the courses that comes to top of mind is certainly organizational development or organization development. Another is needs assessment, because needs assessment is huge in understanding that in the OD world. Also understanding the different takes on how OD interventions can be achieved. So there's the action research side, and then there's the inquiry side. So you have to understand both of them. You have to understand how the organization is looking at change. Is it a top-down push, or is it a let's involve everybody, go from bottom up? Are we looking at solving a problem, or are we looking at actually utilizing our strengths to understand our strengths and build from there? So all this is learned through OD. So if you truly want to go into the OD practice, I would say you really need some of those strong background courses behind you.
Thank you. So I think that's the last question that we have time for. Jenny, do you want to take over? Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dr. Macko and Dr. Lang for sharing knowledge, expertise, and wisdom with us today. If we did not get to your questions, please feel free to send us an email, or you can reach out to the presenters directly via email. On behalf of our OD&C program, we hope you found this webinar helpful. We would like to hear your feedback on our webinar series. Please take the survey using the link in the chat box. If you cannot get the link, we will send it to you via email. Our next webinar is about guiding group and team development by Dr. Maureen Dawson and Catherine Baumgartner on May 28th, Friday from 12 to 1 p.m. Registrations for all events can be found on all of our social media platforms. Thank you all for attending today, and see you in the next webinar. Thank you, Dr. Macko and Dr.
You're
Lang.
welcome.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.
You too.